Hello, Janée. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Chris.
So before I did my first episode of my podcast, I said to myself I would be open to spotlighting a diverse group of creatives. And today's episode, I'm excited to talk to Janée Baugher, an accomplished Ekphrastic writer and book author. Her writing has been published in such journals as Tin House, Southern Review, the American Journal of Poetry, the Writer's Chronicle, just to name a few. And before we start, Janée, where can people see your work?
On my website, www.janeebaugher.com, I have a lot of links to poems and prose that have been published online. So that's a great place to go.
Fantastic. And listeners, please connect with Janée, and I appreciate if you hit the subscribe and like button for our show. So, Janée, here's my first question. I'm sure most people understand and appreciate poetry, but can you explain to us what exactly is ekphrastic writing or ekphrastic poetry is?
So ekphrasis is a term that comes from the Greek meaning to describe. And so in the last 25, 30 years, what creative writers have done, they've used that term, appropriated the term to specifically mean a subgenre of creative writing, which is writing influenced by the visual arts. So, for example, many people are familiar with Donna Tartt's novel that came out in 2014 that won the Pulitzer Prize called The Goldfinch. So there are many excerpts in that novel in which the protagonist describes the painting. So those moments in the novel, that's an example of ekphrastic writing.
Did you have any experience in your life where you remember saying to yourself, I have a passion for this type of writing?
Well, no, I remember having a passion for the visual arts, mainly because I was raised by an artist. And so I saw my mom at work. I saw the pristine canvas or the pristine sheets of paper turn from studies to then finished projects that she would then hang on the walls. And I remember being really awestruck by that process and wishing that I too had that type of artistry. And so I spent many summers visiting museums, specifically in Europe, and looking, wondering. And then finally, when I was in my mid-20s, I got interested in writing. And so it was just natural for me to observe the world in a way that I knew would be potential fodder for my writing, which is to say that anything in the world can be fodder for your writing, anything that enlivens you. And for me, it's aesthetics, it's beauty. And so when I first started writing ekphrastically, I had no direction. I had no teachers who knew what the term was, who introduced me to it. I had no teachers who introduced me to the poems. I had to find that all on my own, and I'm grateful that I did, because I was able to uncover this world in which I thought I would like to be a part of that world. So I even went through graduate school not knowing what the term was, not knowing that people do this and that I might want to do it as well. So sort of through many years of trial and error to sort of land on this subgenre in which I feel is sort of my true calling.
And this subgenre, am I correct in saying that it's still particularly new, right? This is just has been categorized the past maybe 30 years. Am I right there?
Well, yeah, insofar as, what the literary critic would say, but think about people as early as William Blake, who was not only writing poems, but he was also making his own prints. And he's an example of an interdisciplinary writer, artist, who then, because he was making prints and because he was making poems, he found a natural space in which he married the two. And so it's interesting to see that really from the dawn of time, from the start of poetry as a literary art. People have been writing to the visual arts. But it wasn't until about the late 80s to early 90s that people were then associating, like, okay, I'll look at a painting, I'll write a poem, and then the poem will be published, and I will call it an ekphrastic poem. That's relatively new. So I want to give that date as maybe the mid 90s that was starting to happen. I should clarify, mid 1990s.
Okay, gotcha. And I'm trying to formulate this question. So say for myself, I don't write poetry, but say I just want to stick my toe in the water, so to speak. Do I just look at a piece of art that moves me and do some writing with that being an inspiration, and wherever that writing goes, is that automatically being categorized as ekphrastic writing?
I would say yes. And so I wrote a book called The Ekphrastic Writer, Creating Art Influence, Poetry, Fiction, and Nonfiction. And it's the first comprehensive book of its kind that's an actual guidebook for creative writers of all disciplines to, sort of how do I get started? How do I evaluate this type of writing? What's the history of it? What are the conventions? What are some writing prompts? What are the names of other people who've been doing this? And so that's exactly right. It really, ekphrasis, in very simple terms, is just the excuse for getting to the page. It's just the springboard. So, and it doesn't even have to be poetry. It can be any type of writing. So if you are the type of person who you have relationships with the visual arts, or you like a particular sculpture, or you have a watercolor hanging in your bedroom, and if you go to one of those object art and you're looking, and that type of looking, that type of investigative spirit, if that prompts you to the blank page and then you write from that spirit, we're going to call that ekphrastic writing.
You can actually use that art as an inspiration to springboard it to any experience you have in your life. So you could actually maybe start off that writing with that particular art piece, but it go down a road talking about your own experiences in your own life, correct?
Absolutely. And that's really the pleasure of having any type of writing prompt, is because it's just the impetus for getting to that blank page, which for many writers, that's the nightmare. Like, oh, it's a blank page. How do I get started? And so it's just an excuse to get started. But once you get started, what you might find is that you then can excise the impetus for why you got started. So, for example, if you're in Madrid and you see Pablo Picasso's mural Guernica, and you go to the page and starting to describe Guernica, and then in 3 pages, you're actually thinking about your grandmother and the last trip that the two of you took to Budapest, and then it becomes this memory. Then what a wise writer would do was look back at those pages and say, you know what? I think the part in describing Guernica needs to be excised. That needs to be cut out because this piece really concerns my grandmother and being in Budapest with her. So that's kind of the writer's process, is recognizing what began your writing and recognizing where the actual heart of your writing begins.
Okay, because I have a question here, but I think I know the answer now. But one of the questions I have is there any level of self-discovery when you are doing this type of creative writing?
Well, yes, creative writing, just, as the term says, is creative. It's from your imagination. I believe that anyone can be creative, but for some people, it's particularly hard. And by people, I mean adults. And I have great success when I'm teaching young kids. They have no qualms with being creative, inventive, imaginative, kooky. It's my adult students who are like, oh, the grass must be green and the sky must be blue. And so, we tend to get more locked into our left brain, right, as we age. But that's the joy of being any type of creative, is that it's the spirit of discovery. You do not know. And if you go to the page or you go to the canvas already knowing, then maybe you're not being creative. Maybe you're not being inventive. If you know where you're directing your writing, or you know where you're directing the pen, then you are asserting your subordinate, your superiority over your particular art form. So, as creatives, you have to be comfortable not knowing. You have to be comfortable taking risks and chances and being absolutely open to what's going to happen on the page. And not everyone is up for that, because it really is a true experiment. And then, what I tell my students who often get stuck, if I'm writing a piece of nonfiction, I wouldn't want someone to read this. And I tell them, you're putting the cart before the horse. You're creating obstacles before yourself before you've even started on the page. And so it really needs to be, writing creatively really needs to inform you, the writer, first and foremost. And then later, you have to decide if you want to publicize that work.
That's interesting. You said something there about kids being able to do this, or at least start off easier than some adults. Then you think that's because as adults, you overthink it, you're self-aware of, and you are too meticulous with it. And I'm trying to understand from your point of view, how do you successfully do a piece that you say to yourself, I'm proud of this? Is it because you just let yourself go, so to speak? I'm trying to understand the point of view as a writer and your process.
So I should mention my other DNA contributor, my father, is a psychologist. And so he taught me a lot about how the brain works. And it's very interesting to think about our left brain, right brain, our unconscious mind, and our conscious mind. And so I've read a lot about Carl Jung. He's one of my favorites, Jung, for people who don't know. So Carl Jung, he said that anything creative it's not produced by the intellect. It's produced by the play instinct, working with the objects that it loves. So it's with our unconscious mind that we create, that we're imaginative, that we're innovative. And as we age, we are asked to stay more beholden to the left brain, the logical brain, where language exists, where a rational thought processy. So we're asked to speak more from that brain as we age than the right brain, the unconscious mind, when we were young. And so as we age, there are certain techniques that we can learn to speak from that right brain, that creative center. But, I'm very blunt with my students and telling them this conundrum of left brain, right brain is the reason why through the ages we've seen a lot of drug and alcohol abuse with our creatives, because there's this thought process: if I get drunk, if I get stoned, then I am silencing my left logical brain and allowing my right brain, the unconscious mind, to soar. And yes, sure, that's true, but it's a crutch. And, wouldn't it be great if you could do that another way, if you could do it consciously? And there is a method, one of the methods that I have found that I use, that I teach to all of my students, is the method of free writing as the very first stage to a 4-stage writing process, for example. So free writing is, if you don't know, it's like stream of consciousness. Okay. So you go to the page with something in mind. Maybe you're looking at a painting, for example. And so you just start to describe, and you're writing very quickly, and you're not erasing, you're not thinking, you're not worrying about spelling. You're just writing feverishly. writing, 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 writing. And you do that for 10 minutes. And what you're trying to do is detach mentally from what is coming out from your pen. And so this free writing technique it's very difficult when you start, just like when you start anything. If you would like to train for a marathon, perhaps you're starting to train, your first mile is really difficult. But as you get used to it, as you practice it, then it becomes easier and easier. And so it's so that you can freely go to the page. And then after you read it, you feel like, whoa, this is alchemy. This is kookiness. I had no intention I would write X, Y, Z, and look at this. Then you start to welcome in the left brain into that space in terms of the drafting process and the revision process and the editing process to then finally arrive at something that is poised for publication, but that was begun from that space of the imagination.
All this sounds so interesting. And I know earlier you said you had a comprehensive book on ekphrasis. And does that incorporate some of your teaching that you do to your students? And can you remind us again how and where we can get that book?
Yeah, so the Ekphrastic Writer was published by McFarland out of North Carolina. So going to the McFarland website and finding the Ekphrastic Writer is the most direct way to go. The book is also on my website. And so this is a book that it's a paperback. It's $35, really inexpensive, and it gives you everything. I talk about the free writing technique. I talk about how we might revise our ekphrastic poems, fiction and nonfiction. I have included artwork. I curated art for this book that I thought would be great for creative writers. And then once I had settled on about 30 images, I actually reached out to friends who I knew had written ekphrastically in the past and other friends whose work I just really admired. And I said, hey, I don't have any money, but would you be willing to just for free write me a poem or a prose piece, to one of these images that I have here? And so 30 dear friends chose artwork and wrote me their pieces, and I've included that in the Ekphrastic Writer, which is really great because it's a book in which this is brand new ekphrastic writing that's never been previously published. So you can see, on a contemporary level, what are the practitioners doing today? What are the various conventions are they using? What's an ekphrastic autobiographical piece? What's an ekphrastic piece of flash fiction? What are the various types of ekphrastic poems that can be written? And so, yes, this is a book that teaches you how to do everything. Look at art, select art, write on to or about art, revise the pieces. I even talk a little bit about publishing, about teaching ekphrasis to students. And then I also talk about technology in ekphrasis and how artificial intelligence is doing all sorts of really crazy things right now. And I think that ekphrasis, meaning the ability, your ability to describe well, which is a rhetorical mode that's very, very sophisticated. I think our ability to describe is going to be much more important with artificial intelligence than it has, in the last probably 50 years. And so I was really excited to include this chapter on ekphrasis and technology in this book. So hopefully I've run the gamut in this book, although I'm also busily working on the second edition.
And congratulations getting that book published. And it sounds like a work of art. And it's going to be really awesome because you have other people's writing in there, your contemporaries, your friends. And for someone like myself who is so new to this, I can look at art and say, oh, I like that. I don't like that. But when I'm reading a bunch of different ekphrasis and ekphrastic writing from you and other people, I get to kind of see how people look at things and how they look at that art and put the words towards that. So let me ask you this question. How do you personally know when the writing you have done yourself is exceptional? Or maybe the better question is, for someone like myself to understand, what do you look for in other people's writings to say that was perfectly executed? Well,
that's a good question. And so my succinct answer is I'm looking for more than what's there. So, for example, Guernica, Pablo Picasso's Guernica. I could look at that painting because I have two perfectly good eyes. And so I don't necessarily need a poem that just describes what I'm seeing. Now, describing the painting is really important. We have the visually impaired population. And so if you've ever been in a museum with a visually impaired person, then your ability to describe becomes very important. And what's terrific in what I've done in my research, especially for the Ekphrastic writers, that I've learned all sorts of new ways that museums are opening up their accessibility to people such as the visually impaired. So because I have eyesight, I want to read an ekphrastic poem that gives me more than I can see. And there's no real formula for that. I just want sort of a depth of experience, because there's the experience of looking at the painting and then the experience of reading the poem. So we can't say the poem is about XYZ. We can't say the painting is about XYZ. Both of those are experiences. So I also want a unique experience of that painting in reading that flash fiction piece or that little memoir piece or the poem.
Would you be interested in reading some of your poetry in this podcast?
Yes. So I have a poem called The Mother that I wrote in response to a painting called The Mother. And this painting is on the cover of my first, not the painting, the image of the painting is on the cover of my first book, Coördinates of Yes. So I thought, since you will be showing an image of this cover, this might be a nice way where people can, look at the painting as well as hear the poem. So shall I read that?
Absolutely.
Okay. The Mother, after the painting by Peter de Hoek. On a stool, the mother of two, having just nursed, laces her orange bodice. She gazes down at the sated babe. The room, dim, except for a column of light from the clear story, which colors the claret cloak and shines the brass bed warmer, both perched on the wall behind her. In the background, her other child in the foyer. At the open Dutch door, the sun baptizes her 4-year-old face. One ankle raises off the checkerboard floor. Mother and elder daughter illuminated by different courses of the same light. The mother, content in domesticity. The daughter, her back to them, prepares to run.
Thank you for sharing that. And I'm actually going to try to pull that up and looking forward to putting that on the social media site where we have that picture and pair that up with your writing. I mentioned in the intro, you have had your work published in numerous publications. Is there any particular one of yours that you're most proud of?
Oh, goodness. Well, yeah, as a literary artist, there aren't very many opportunities for me to have my work displayed in public spaces. And so, so often you can see murals, you can see sculptures, but you don't often just see a random poem somewhere. But there's a town here in Washington called Shoreline, the city of Shoreline, and they had a call for submissions for poems to be commissioned. And so I sent in some work. And so I was, one of maybe 10 or 12 poets who were selected. And so what I was tasked with, this was back in May. So the coronavirus had already locked us down for about 2 months. And I thought, gosh, should I even leave my house and go to the parks and try to write poems? And I thought, well, yes, of course I should leave my house and go to the parks and write poems. That sounds like a fantastic idea. So I went to, I think, 10 park sites in the city of Shoreline. And the task was at certain places around the park to find where they have this post where they would then display a poem, and you were to presumably just write a poem to that particular coordinates in the park.
Interesting.
And so I spent one whole day and I wrote 9 poems. I went to 9 locations and wrote 9 poems. And it was such a great experience because, as I was saying earlier, a great obstacle that we have as artists is to think about our audience. It's best not to do it. And I mean, sure, in some respects, like, yes, I need to spell check. Yes, I need to make sure I'm not inventing language that, people are going to be off put by. I mean, so of course, there's some precision that you have to strive for. But when I was writing these poems in the park, I'm standing in this place where my poem is going to be printed and displayed, laminated and displayed, which meant that it was very easy for me to imagine other people like myself who love nature and love walking in parks, standing there, seeing what I'm seeing. What did I want to say to them? And it was such an interesting experience for me. My poems, those 9 poems, took a totally different direction than I normally take. They're very philosophical, very tender, they almost felt like little love letters. I felt like I was writing love letters to these people who I didn't know, but they were, they're my neighbors and they're art lovers. And so those are up online. And also so not only are the poems laminated in those spots, but they're also online. And then I did an audio. And then a couple of them, the fellow who facilitated this event, for some reason, he decided that a couple of my poems should be translated in Tagalog. And so then we have like these dual. So it was just such a thrill. So I'm very proud to have those poems displayed in the parks.
Wow, that concept is brilliant. I don't know who came up with it, but I am moved by nature. I do like walking around nature and trail walking, and sometimes that environment, I take it in, I process it, and it stays with me. But to actually formulate it into words, creative writing in that space was a brilliant idea. Your website also says that you've collaborated with dancers, composers, and visual artists. Please tell us about what projects and the synergy that you feel when working with other creatives.
Well, one of my great pleasures as a teacher was I got to spend 7 summers at Interlochen Center for the Arts Camp in Michigan. And so while I was there teaching creative writing, I made friends with the other teachers. Some of them were musicians, some of them were in the musical theater, some of them were in the visual arts department and the dance department, you name it. And so it was just a natural environment for us to collaborate as teachers, which was really magical. That was the first time I was able to introduce my writing students to like a painting studio. And so I was able to do this exchange with the painting teacher, with her painting kids and my writing students. And that was really magical. And so through that experience, making friends there, just, show me your art. What are you working on? Had a conversation with a woman who was the director of the dance department at the University of Cincinnati at the time. And she had never adapted any text for the stage. All of her dance choreography was based on music. And because we made a friendship, she thought, well, this could be a really interesting thing. So she was interested in discovering, a different way to enter her art form. And so she said, hey, will you send me some poems and I'll look through them and see if maybe I want to adapt one of them for the stage. And so we went back and forth and back and forth. And it's funny, this was, I was just talking to a friend about this 17 years ago. So the summer of 2003, and then she actually selected a piece and then did a stage adaptation of one of my actually it was an ekphrastic poem, and did a stage adaptation at the University of Cincinnati. And so my family and I went out to see their performance, and that was in the spring of 2004. And so then since that adaptation, I met other choreographers, other dancers, met other composers, and then sort of everywhere I go, if I'm at an artist in residency or, some sort of event, I have conversations with people who are also artists who are maybe interested in collaborating, and that's how it happens. And it's just lovely. It's lovely to work with other creatives because, there's that interest in being innovative. There's that interest in like, well, let me take a risk. And, I've never gone in that direction. Let me, how do you think this is going to work? And my attitude is always, it's going to work great. It's like, oh, the possibility, there's this idea of yes, like, you just say yes, and then you sort of figure out the details later. So yeah, in a nutshell, for the past, 17 years, I've had a handful of poems adapted for the stage and set to music, and that's been a great thrill.
I hold teachers in high regard. My high school teacher in particular has had a heavy influence in me being an artist and enjoying and appreciating art. Could you please tell us a little bit about, you've mentioned here a couple times in this podcast that you do teach writing. How's that experience been for you?
Well, I don't know if you can be a teacher and not also love to be a student. So for me, those two things really go hand in hand. So every day in the classroom is an opportunity for me to learn as well. And it's funny, like since I started teaching at Interlochen, which is 2003, now my kiddos, went on to finish high school, earn a bachelor's, earn a master's degree, have families, and that's been really fun too. Some of them have actually gone into the literary field. And so that's just been really such a thrill. I know that, my father, who I mentioned as a psychologist, is also a teacher. So learning was really important in the house. And so I know that had a huge effect on me. And I had great teachers as well. And so I'm absolutely grateful. I'm thinking about even the Ekphrastic Writer. If you look at my bibliography pages, I read over 250 books and articles just to put together this, 200-page guidebook. And so, were it not for all of their teachings that I learned from, I couldn't have produced this book. So I'm grateful to them as well.
Great. And we're here in the end of the podcast, and I'm going to shoot you a couple of questions here just to get to know you better. If you could spend a day with another popular author, who would you choose?
I think I would choose Donna Tartt, the author I mentioned earlier. She wrote The Goldfinch as well as My Little Friend and The Secret History. I would really like to know how she thinks and how she lives her days in solitude. Yeah.
And how did you celebrate when you finished your first book?
I went out to dinner. We had champagne. I accepted flowers and balloons and lots of cheers.
What do you do when you get writer's block?
I don't get writer's block. Writer's block is, for the most part, I think it's a phantom pain. And what a writer needs to do is just find that writing prompt to get them to the page without any conscious intent, and also keeping at bay the idea of audience. So for me, writer's block doesn't exist. What does exist is a perfectionistic attitude, or maybe moments of depression where you feel like you don't have anything to really contribute. But if you have pen and paper and working hands and forearms, there's no reason that you can't do a free write.
Janée, how do you personally define success?
Happiness. So if I feel happy and content, which for me has to do with contributing, has to do with community, then I feel successful in that. I'm very blessed. But I give back. I'm interested in building a community and having those symbiotic relationships within community.
Great answer. And I want to thank you personally for sharing your awesome creative journey and telling us about ekphrastic writing. This is going to be very new to probably a lot of people listening to the podcast, but we are grateful that you did that, and I appreciate you. And where can people connect with you again or get your book? Can you remind us here in the end?
Yeah, so you can connect with me on Instagram. I'm at Ekphrastic_writer, or my website, JaneeBaugher.com.
Awesome. And thank you, Janée. Until next time, everyone, take care and bye.
Thank you.